The Silence in the Cedar Chest, Chapter 1. My grandmother, Margaret, was a woman who carried secrets like stones in her pocket. Not out of malice, I don't believe, but out of a sense of duty, a protective instinct that often meant burying difficult truths to maintain appearances, to keep the peace. She was the matriarch of our family, a woman whose quiet strength and unwavering resolve were the foundation upon which our family history was built. When she passed away at the age of 92, after a long and full life, it felt like the end of an era, the closing of a significant chapter in our family's story. I'm Clara. I'm 63 now, a widow, my children grown. I had always been close to my grandmother, drawn to her quiet wisdom and the sense of deep history she embodied. When the lawyer informed me that she had left me her hope chest, the large, intricately carved cedar chest that had sat at the foot of her bed for as long as I could remember, it felt like a fitting inheritance, a tangible piece of her legacy. The chest itself was beautiful, dark wood, carved with roses and vines, smelling faintly of cedar and old memories. The chest was delivered to my home a few weeks after her passing. It sat in my living room, a silent, imposing presence, filled with the scent of cedar and the weight of generations. I knew it contained linens, blankets, things she had collected throughout her life, preparing for a future that had long since become her past. Opening it felt like a sacred act, a way of connecting with her, of sifting through the layers of her life. Inside, carefully folded, were beautiful quilts she had made, embroidered pillowcases, hand-stitched sheets, and beneath it all, tucked away in the very bottom, beneath a layer of tissue paper, I found a small, sealed envelope. It was addressed to me in my grandmother's familiar, slightly shaky handwriting, and marked simply, "For Clara, to be opened after my passing." My heart gave a little jump, a personal message left for me alone. What secrets, what final thoughts had she entrusted to this envelope? With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside, there was no long letter, no heartfelt farewell. Instead, there was a single, folded piece of paper with a few lines written on it, and a small, tarnished silver key. The note read, "Clara, my dear, the truth is heavy, too heavy for one soul to carry forever. The hope chest holds more than just linens. There is a compartment hidden. The key is here. It holds the story of Sarah. Sarah, she disappeared. So long ago, a shadow fell over our family. A secret was kept to protect us, to protect her. But the truth deserves to be known, the full truth. It is a difficult story, Clara, one of sorrow, of choices made, of consequences carried. Find the compartment, use the key, read her words, understand her fate, and perhaps you can find the peace that eluded us. With love and a heavy heart, Grandmother." My mind reeled. Sarah, a disappearance, a shadow, a secret kept. Her words, fragmented and cryptic, hinted at a hidden compartment in the chest, holding the story of someone named Sarah, someone who had disappeared long ago, her fate shrouded in secrecy and sorrow. Who was Sarah? A relative? A child? The note offered no last name, no clear connection. My grandmother had a sister named Sarah, who had passed away when I was a teenager. Was this about her? But she hadn't disappeared. She had died after a long illness. The chest, the beautiful cedar chest, suddenly felt less like a symbol of hope and future and more like a repository of buried secrets, of a past that was darker and more complex than I had ever imagined. I examined the chest, running my hands along the smooth wood, searching for a hidden compartment. It was beautifully crafted, the panels fitting together seamlessly. Where could a compartment be hidden in this solid piece of furniture? I remembered the key, the small, tarnished silver key. It was intricate, old. It didn't look like a key to the main lock of the chest. It must belong to the hidden compartment. I searched the chest more meticulously, feeling along the inside surfaces, looking for any unusual seams, any hidden latches. The scent of cedar filled the air, mingling with the faint, old smell of the wood itself. After several minutes of searching, my fingers brushed against a small, raised area on the inside of the lid, near the hinge. It was a piece of carving, slightly different from the others. I pressed it, and with a faint click, a narrow panel slid open along the top edge of the chest, revealing a hidden cavity within the lid. My heart pounded in my chest, the hidden compartment. Inside, nestled in the dark cedar wood, were bundles of letters, tied with faded ribbons, and a small, worn diary. The scent of cedar was stronger here, mingling with the faint smell of old paper and something else, something like dried flowers and a hint of salt air. The letters were old, the handwriting different from my grandmother's. The diary was small, its cover faded, the pages yellowed and brittle. A name was inscribed on the inside cover, in a delicate hand, Sarah. This was it, the story of Sarah, the woman who disappeared, the secret my grandmother had kept. With trembling hands, I picked up the diary, opening its pages, stepping into a past I knew nothing about, a past my grandmother had carefully concealed, a past that was finally revealing itself through the whispering silence of the cedar chest. Chapter 2. The diary belonged to Sarah. The letters were likely hers too. My grandmother's note, the hidden compartment, the key. It was all about Sarah, the woman who disappeared, her story buried for decades within the cedar chest. I settled into a quiet corner, the diary in my hands, the weight of the unknown heavy in my heart. The first entry was dated 1938. Sarah would have been a young woman then, in her late teens. The entries were personal, reflections on her life, her dreams, her everyday experiences. She wrote about her family, her parents, her siblings. She mentioned her sister, Margaret, my grandmother. They were close, shared secrets and dreams. Sarah's entries painted a picture of a young woman full of life, with a vibrant spirit and a deep love for the sea. She lived in a small coastal town similar to Port Blossom, though the name wasn't explicitly mentioned in the early entries. She wrote about her dreams of becoming a writer, of traveling the world, of a life beyond the confines of their small town. Then her entries became more focused on a young man named Thomas. She wrote about meeting him, about their courtship, about falling deeply in love. Their love story unfolded in the pages of the diary. A tender and passionate connection. Thomas was a fisherman, strong and kind, with a quiet understanding of Sarah's adventurous spirit. But their love faced challenges. Sarah's family, particularly her father, seemed to disapprove of Thomas. He was a fisherman with no land, no prospects beyond the sea. They wanted Sarah to marry someone more suitable, someone who could provide a more secure future. Sarah wrote about the arguments with her father, the pressure to end the relationship, the pain of being caught between her love for Thomas and her family's expectations. As the entries continued, Sarah's love for Thomas deepened, becoming an unwavering resolve. She wrote about defying her father, about her determination to be with Thomas, no matter the cost. Then the entries took a dramatic turn. Sarah wrote about being pregnant with Thomas's child, the joy and terror of the news, the fear of her family's reaction, the desperate need to tell Thomas. Her entry, dated June 1939, was filled with fear and desperation. June 10th, 1939, I told him. Thomas knows. He was shocked at first, but then he held me. He said he loved me. He said we would face it together. We will tell my family tonight. I am so scared. Father will be furious. Mother, I don't know how she will react, but we love each other. We will be a family. The entries that followed described the devastating confrontation with her family. Her father's explosive anger, her mother's quiet tears, her siblings' shocked silence. They demanded she end the relationship with Thomas, that she give up the baby, that she leave town to avoid the scandal. Sarah refused. She stood firm, choosing Thomas, choosing their child, choosing the life they would build together, even if it meant defying her family, even if it meant being disowned. June 12th, 1939. They mean it. Father said I am no longer his daughter. Mother is heartbroken. Margaret, even Margaret, she seems so distant, scared. They want me to leave, to go away, to hide. But I won't. I won't hide. I will be with Thomas. We will raise our child together, here, in our town. We have done nothing to be ashamed of. But the pressure continued. Whispers in the town, the weight of societal judgment, the shame brought upon her family. Sarah wrote about feeling increasingly isolated, about the difficulty of finding work, about the fear of facing the future alone, even with Thomas by her side. Her family, it seemed, made it clear that her presence in town, her visible pregnancy, was a constant source of embarrassment and a threat to their reputation. Then, a series of cryptic entries, hints of a plan being made, a difficult decision being discussed, references to leaving, to going somewhere safe, to a place where they wouldn't be judged. Thomas was resistant, wanting to stay and fight, but Sarah was becoming increasingly fearful for their child, for the life they could build under the weight of their family's disapproval and the town's judgment. August 5th, 1939. We are leaving. Tomorrow. Thomas agreed. It is for the best, he says. For the baby. For our future. We will go away. Start somewhere new. A place where no one knows us, where we can be a family. Just us. It breaks my heart to leave Margaret, to leave everything I know. But I have to. For our baby, for Thomas. We are going to the coast, to a small town Thomas knows, a quiet place. We will be safe there. We will be a family. They left, Sarah, Thomas, and their unborn child. They went to the coast, to a small town, to start a new life, away from the judgment, away from the secrets, away from the family who had disowned her. The diary entries stopped there. The letters in the hidden compartment were from the years that followed. Letters from Sarah to her sister, Margaret, my grandmother. They were written intermittently, sent secretly, filled with news of their new life on the coast. She wrote about their baby, a boy, born healthy and strong. She wrote about their struggles, about Thomas working hard, about building a life together in a new place. She wrote about her longing for her family, for Margaret, for a reconciliation that seemed impossible. The letters revealed the name of their son, David Miller. David Miller, born in 1940, raised on the coast, the secret son of Sarah and Thomas, hidden away from their disapproving family. The last letter from Sarah was dated 1945. It was short, filled with a quiet sadness. She wrote about the war ending, about hoping for a chance to visit, to somehow reconnect. But the tone was resigned, as if she knew the chasm between them, created by her choice, by her family's rejection, was too wide to bridge. After 1945, there were no more letters from Sarah. The story in the cedar chest ended there, leaving me with so many questions. What happened to Sarah, Thomas, and their son David? Did they live a happy life on the coast? Did they ever reconnect with my grandmother, with their family? Or did something else happen? Chapter 2.1. The diary and letters in the hidden compartment painted a vivid picture of Sarah, my grandmother's sister, a young woman who defied societal norms and family expectations to be with the man she loved, Thomas, and to keep their child. Their secret departure to the coast in 1939, to a small town where they could raise their son David away from judgment, was a monumental choice with profound consequences. The story in the cedar chest ended abruptly after 1945, leaving the fate of Sarah, Thomas, and their son David unknown. My grandmother, Margaret, had kept this story hidden for decades, preserving Sarah's diary and letters as a silent testament to her sister's life, her courage, and the secret branch of our family tree that had been severed by disapproval and distance. The choice to keep it secret was likely born of a complex mix of loyalty to her parents, fear of scandal, and perhaps a sense of guilt for not being able to bridge the gap with her sister. My task now felt clear. I needed to find out what happened to Sarah, Thomas, and their son, David Miller. Did they live a long and happy life on the coast, or did something tragic befall them? Did David grow up knowing the story of his parents' sacrifice, of the family they left behind? I began my search on the coast, focusing on the small towns that might have been the destination of a fisherman named Thomas in 1939. The letters didn't explicitly name the town, but they spoke of a quiet place, a place by the sea. I started by researching coastal towns in the region, looking for records of anyone named Thomas Miller, a fisherman, living there in the 1940s. It was a broad search, as Miller is a common name and fisherman is a common occupation in coastal communities. I also focused my search on anyone named Sarah Miller, born around 1920, her age based on the diary entries, who might have lived on the coast with a husband named Thomas and a son named David. The search was challenging. Records from that era were often incomplete, especially for people who may have been trying to live a low-profile life away from their original homes. Decades had passed, memories had faded, and people had moved on. While researching, I found a mention of a severe storm that hit the coast in the early 1950s, a storm that caused significant damage to coastal communities and affected fishing fleets. Could this storm be connected to the silence in the letters after 1945? Did something happen to Thomas, the fisherman, during that storm? I delved deeper into the records of that storm, looking for lists of casualties, reports of damage to fishing boats. I found names of fishermen who were lost at sea during the storm. Among them, I found a listing for a Thomas Miller. Died at sea, 1952. His age aligned with the age of Sarah's husband, Thomas. His occupation was listed as fisherman. The location was off the coast, near a small town called Port Serenity. Port Serenity. Could this be the quiet coastal town where Sarah and Thomas built their life? The possibility that Thomas, Sarah's beloved husband and the father of her son, was lost at sea was heartbreaking. It would explain the sudden end of the letters after 1945, the silence that followed. A young woman who had defied her family for love, now facing life alone in a new town, with a young son, after losing her husband to the sea. If this Thomas Miller was indeed Sarah's husband, what happened to Sarah and their son David after he died? Did Sarah stay in Port Serenity? Did she try to make a life for herself and her son? Or did the loss, the isolation, the hardships of being a young widow with a child force her to make difficult choices? I focused my search on Port Serenity, looking for records of Sarah Miller and her son David after 1952. I searched for death records for Sarah Miller, looking for a passing around that time or later. I searched for records of David Miller, looking for any sign of his life, his upbringing, his whereabouts. The records from Port Serenity were sparse for that period. It was a small town, and record-keeping may not have been as thorough as in larger communities. I found no death record for Sarah Miller in Port Serenity after 1952. No clear records of David Miller growing up there. The silence surrounding Sarah and David after Thomas's death felt significant. Did something happen to them? Did they leave Port Serenity? If so, where did they go? The letters from Sarah to my grandmother Margaret held clues to their emotional connection, their shared history. But they didn't provide a clear path to finding Sarah or David after 1952. My search felt like it had hit a wall. The records were incomplete. The trail had gone cold. The story of Sarah, Thomas, and David, the secret branch of my family tree, seemed to end with Thomas's tragic death at sea. Chapter 2.2. The possibility that Thomas Miller, Sarah's husband, died at sea in 1952 in a storm off the coast of Port Serenity added a tragic layer to the story of my grandmother's sister and her secret family. It provided a potential explanation for the silence in the letters after 1945, the abrupt end to Sarah's updates. But it didn't explain what happened to Sarah and their son David. After Thomas's death, did Sarah stay in Port Serenity and remarry? Did she return to her hometown, seeking reconciliation with her family after her husband was gone? Or did she and David disappear, their story lost to the complexities of the past? My search for Sarah and David after 1952 continued, focusing on Port Serenity and surrounding areas, but also expanding my search to other regions, considering the possibility that Sarah might have moved away after her husband's death. I searched for marriage records for Sarah Miller, looking for a second marriage that might have changed her name. I searched for school records for David Miller, looking for him attending school in a different town. The records were frustratingly incomplete. It was as if Sarah and David had simply vanished from official view after 1952. The silence surrounding their lives felt deliberate, or perhaps a consequence of difficult circumstances that forced them to live off the grid. I revisited Sarah's letters to my grandmother, looking for any small detail I might have missed, any hint of a backup plan, a contact person, or a relative she might turn to in times of trouble. The letters were filled with her love for Thomas and David, her hopes for their future, her longing for reconciliation with her family. But they offered no concrete clues about what she might do if something happened to Thomas. My grandmother, Margaret, was the key to understanding the secret, the person who had kept Sarah's story hidden for so long. Her note in the cedar chest, her cryptic words about Sarah's disappearance and fate, hinted at a knowledge that went beyond simply losing touch. Sarah, she disappeared so long ago. A shadow fell over our family. This suggested a more definitive end than just losing contact, a disappearance that cast a long shadow over their family. I needed to understand what my grandmother knew. Why did she believe Sarah disappeared? Was it a literal disappearance or a different kind of vanishing, a severing of ties so complete it felt like a disappearance? I looked for any other documents related to Sarah in my grandmother's belongings, anything that might shed more light on what happened after 1952. I found old family photographs, but none of Sarah, Thomas, or David from after their departure in 1939. It was as if their existence had been erased from the family album after they left. I also looked for any records of communication between my grandmother and Sarah after the last letter in 1945. There were none in the cedar chest or amongst my grandmother's other papers. The connection, it seemed, had been severed. The phrase, "a shadow fell over our family," in my grandmother's note resonated with a sense of something difficult, something perhaps even scandalous that had happened related to Sarah's disappearance. Was it a tragic accident like Thomas's death at sea that also claims Sarah and David? Or was it something else entirely? My research into the history of Port Serenity from the 1950s revealed stories of hardships faced by fishing families after the storm of 1952, of families struggling to survive after losing their breadwinners. It was a difficult time for many in the community. Could Sarah and David have faced such hardships that they were forced to leave, to seek help elsewhere, perhaps even forced apart? The possibility that Sarah, facing immense difficulties after Thomas's death, had to make a heartbreaking choice regarding David, perhaps placing him in an orphanage or with relatives, was a painful thought. Could this be the disappearance my grandmother referred to? Sarah disappearing from David's life? David disappearing from Sarah's life? The silence surrounding Sarah and David after 1952 felt increasingly deliberate, a carefully guarded secret. Who else in my family might have known something? My parents? My aunts and uncles? They were all gone now, taking their knowledge, their secrets with them. The cedar chest held Sarah's story up to 1945, but the years that followed were a blank. The fate of Sarah and David, the secret branch of my family tree, remained shrouded in mystery. A shadow cast over our family history, a shadow I was determined to bring into the light. Chapter 3.1. The mystery of Sarah and David Miller's fate after 1952 felt like an impenetrable wall. The official records were silent, and the family history I knew contained no answers. My grandmother's cryptic note hinted at a disappearance and a secret kept to protect the family, but the details remained elusive. I knew that Thomas, Sarah's husband, likely died at sea in 1952, leaving Sarah a widow with a young son in a challenging time and place. But what happened next? Where did they go? I decided to focus my research on the period immediately following Thomas's presumed death. If Sarah faced hardship, where would she turn? Would she try to contact her family? The family who had disowned her? Or would she seek help from other sources, perhaps social services, or relatives she had remained in touch with? I revisited Sarah's letters to my grandmother, searching for any mention of other family members Sarah was close to, any cousins or aunts who might have offered support after she left home. The letters mentioned my grandmother, her sister, as her closest confidant, but offered no other names of relatives she stayed in touch with. I also looked for any records of Sarah attempting to contact her family after 1939. There were none in my grandmother's collection. It seemed the break had been clean. The silence between Sarah and her family, besides the secret letters to my grandmother, complete. The phrase in my grandmother's note, "A shadow fell over our family," kept haunting me. It suggested something more than just losing contact. It hinted at something difficult, something perhaps even shameful or tragic that had happened, something that caused a disruption, a shadow cast over our family's reputation or sense of self. Was it related to Sarah's disappearance? To David's fate? My search led me to explore different possibilities for Sarah's whereabouts after 1952. Could she have remarried? Could she have moved to another state, seeking a fresh start? Could she have faced such severe hardship that she was forced to place David in an orphanage or foster care? I searched online archives for records of orphanages or children's homes in the region during the 1950s, looking for a child named David Miller, born in 1940, who might have been placed there. The records were often digitized and searchable, but privacy laws and incomplete historical data made this search challenging. I found no clear matches for a David Miller with that birth date in orphanages in the area. I also considered the possibility that Sarah, after her husband's death, returned to her hometown, seeking reconciliation with her family, despite the past rejection. If she returned, would there be any record of it? Any mention in local newspapers or town records? I researched local records from the 1950s, looking for any sign of Sarah Miller returning to her hometown. There was no mention of her. It seemed she had remained on the coast or moved elsewhere, never returning to the family who had disowned her. The silence surrounding Sarah and David after 1952 felt increasingly deliberate, a carefully guarded secret. It wasn't just that their lives were undocumented. It was as if their history had been actively erased or suppressed. Who would have the motivation and the means to do this? My own family? The family who had initially rejected Sarah and her child? The thought that my own family, my grandmother's parents, or even other siblings might have been involved in something that led to Sarah and David's disappearance from public record was a disturbing possibility. Could they have intervened after Thomas's death, perhaps forcing Sarah to give up David, or somehow ensuring that their story was kept hidden to avoid any lingering scandal? The shadow my grandmother mentioned, was it about the shame of Sarah's out-of-wedlock child, a shame that the family wanted to bury completely after Thomas, the suitable cover for Sarah's situation on the coast, was gone? Was it about a more active involvement in Sarah and David's fate after 1952? I needed to find out more about my grandmother's family, about her parents and siblings, about the family dynamics and secrets from that era. My grandmother was the keeper of the secret, the one who had the journals and letters. But other family members might have known, or suspected something about Sarah's fate. My parents were gone. Their generation had carried the secret, if they knew it. But I had cousins, children of my grandmother's other siblings. Perhaps they had heard stories, whispers, something that could shed light on the shadow that fell over our family. I decided to reach out to my cousin, Thomas Vance, my grandmother's brother's son. He was older than me, had lived in our hometown his whole life, and might have heard things, stories about the family history that I was unaware of. Chapter 3.2. Reaching out to my cousin, Thomas Vance, felt like another step into the unknown, a way of potentially disturbing long-held family silences. He was the son of my grandmother's brother, also named Thomas, a man who had passed away years ago. My cousin Thomas was in his late 70s, had lived a quiet life in our hometown, steeped in the history of our family. I called him, a little hesitant, unsure of how to broach the subject of a hidden family secret, a missing relative from decades ago. I started by mentioning my grandmother's passing and the cedar chest she had left me, and the discovery of old journals and letters within it. I mentioned the name Sarah and the fact that the journals hinted at a story I knew nothing about, a story from the late 1930s and early 1940s. Thomas listened patiently, his voice quiet, thoughtful. "Sarah," he repeated softly. "Yes, I remember hearing about a Sarah, my father's sister, your grandmother's sister. She left home years ago, didn't she? After some kind of difficulty?" His words were cautious, hinting at a knowledge of the basic story, but perhaps not the full truth. "Yes," I confirmed. "She left in 1939. According to the journals, she went to the coast with a man named Thomas Miller, and they had a son, David." Thomas was silent for a moment. "A son," he said. "I didn't know she had a son." His tone suggested genuine surprise, or perhaps a carefully maintained pretense of ignorance. I explained about the journals and letters covering their life on the coast until 1945, and the silence that followed. I mentioned my research into Thomas Miller's likely death at sea in 1952, and the subsequent disappearance of Sarah and David from public record. I explained my grandmother's note in the cedar chest, her words about Sarah disappearing and a shadow falling over our family. "The shadow," Thomas said, his voice lower now. "Yes, I remember the shadow, a sense of something not spoken about, a quiet sadness in the family, especially around your grandmother and my father." He confirmed that his father, my great-uncle Thomas Vance, rarely spoke of his sister Sarah. There was a sense of her being gone, her name mentioned only in hushed tones, if at all. It was clear that the story of Sarah's departure, her choice to defy her family, had created a deep rift, a wound that never fully healed. "My father," Thomas continued, his voice hesitant, He went to the coast once, in the 1950s, after the big storm. He went to see about Sarah." My heart leaped. My great-uncle went to the coast after the storm of 1952, the same storm that likely claimed Thomas Miller's life. Did he find Sarah? Did he find David? Did he learn what happened to them? "He didn't say much when he came back," Thomas said. "Just that it was difficult, that he had done what he could, and that Sarah was taken care of, and that the boy was also taken care of. Separately. The word chilled me. Sarah and David taken care of separately. What did that mean? Did Sarah face such hardship after Thomas's death that she was unable to care for David? Did the family intervene? Did they force her to give him up? Did he say where they were taken care of? I asked, my voice urgent. Did he say who took care of them? Thomas was quiet for a moment. No, he said softly. He didn't. He just said it was for the best, for the boy, to give him a chance at a different life, a life away from the difficulties, the hardship after Thomas's death, the potential for a young widow with a child to struggle in a tough coastal town. Or was it something else? Something the family orchestrated? Did he ever mention a place? I pressed. An orphanage? Relatives? He mentioned a place with trees, Thomas said, his brow furrowed in thought. A place away from the sea. Quiet. That's all I remember. A place with trees. A place with trees. A cryptic clue, but perhaps a starting point. A place where David, a young boy who had just lost his father, was taken care of separately from his mother. Was it an institution? A different family? The shadow my grandmother mentioned, the disappearance, the secret kept to protect the family. It was all connected to this moment in 1952, to my great-uncle's visit to the coast, to Sarah and David being taken care of separately. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, forming a picture of a family secret far more complex and heartbreaking than I had initially imagined. It wasn't just about Sarah leaving home with her love. It was about what happened after, about loss, about intervention, and about a mother and son being separated, their lives perhaps deliberately rerouted to bury a secret that had always felt like a stain on the family name. Chapter 4.1 The conversation with my cousin Thomas provided crucial missing pieces to the puzzle of Sarah and David Miller's fate. My great-uncle, Thomas Vance, had gone to the coast after the storm of 1952, confirming that Sarah and David were still there after Thomas Miller's presumed death at sea. His cryptic words about Sarah and David being taken care of separately, and his mention of a place with trees, hinted at a forced separation, a redirection of their lives orchestrated by the family. The shadow my grandmother mentioned was likely related to this intervention, this act of taking a mother's child and placing him elsewhere, all to bury the lingering scandal of Sarah's original choice and her out-of-wedlock son. My search for David Miller, the boy taken to a place with trees, took on a new, more focused direction. I needed to find institutions or locations fitting that description that would have existed in the region in the 1950s, places where a child might have been placed for care or adoption. I researched children's homes, orphanages, and private boarding schools in the area, looking for institutions located in areas known for their trees, areas away from the coast. The records from that era were often incomplete, and the names of children placed in care were sometimes changed, or their histories deliberately obscured to protect their identities, or the identities of the families involved. I worked with the genealogist again, focusing on this specific period and this new, albeit cryptic, clue. She had experience in navigating adoption records and institutional histories, a complex and often sensitive area of research. Simultaneously, I continued to search for any further information about Sarah Miller after 1952. What happened to her after David was taken away? Did she return to her hometown broken and alone? Or did she disappear entirely, unable to face a life without her husband and her son? I revisited the records of Port Serenity, looking for any sign of Sarah Miller after 1952. Any record of her leaving the town, any connection to a place with trees. The records remained silent. It was as if after Thomas's death and the family's intervention, Sarah had simply ceased to exist in the official narrative. The place with trees clue was frustratingly vague. It could refer to a specific institution, a town, or even just a general description of a rural area. The genealogist helped me identify potential institutions in the region that existed in the 1950s and were located in areas known for their forests or trees. We compiled a list of possibilities, daunting in its length. We began the painstaking process of researching these institutions, looking for any records of a child named David, born in 1940, who might have been placed there in 1952 or shortly after. Accessing these records was often difficult due to privacy regulations and the age of the documents. As the weeks turned into months, the genealogist uncovered fragments of information related to one specific institution, the Greenwood Children's Home, located in a rural area known for its extensive forests, a few hours inland from Port Serenity. There were mentions in old administrative records of a child named David, matching David Miller's age, who was admitted to the home in late 1952. The records were incomplete, but the timing and the location felt significant. Could this be the place with trees my cousin Thomas mentioned? Could the Greenwood Children's Home be where David was taken after being separated from his mother? We delved deeper into the history of the Greenwood Children's Home, looking for any further records related to David. We found an entry detailing his admission, listing his name as David and his date of birth as May 1940. The name of the person who placed him in the home was listed as Thomas Vance, my great-uncle. This was it. Confirmation. My great-uncle, Thomas Vance, had taken David, his sister Sarah's son, to the Greenwood Children's Home in 1952. Shortly after Thomas Miller's death, the family's intervention, the forced separation of mother and son, the taking care of separately, it had all happened here at this institution with trees. The record also contained information about David's time at the home, his health, his development, and then an entry detailing his discharge from the home a few years later, not back to his mother, not to his biological family in Port Serenity or his original hometown. The entry stated he was placed with a foster family, a family in a different part of the state, for long-term care. His name was listed as David Vance. David Miller, the son of Sarah Miller and Thomas Miller, raised in secret as David Vance by his great-aunt and great-uncle after his father's death and his mother's disappearance from his life. The layers of hidden identity and family secrets were immense. Chapter 4.2: The discovery of David Miller, now David Vance, being placed in the Greenwood Children's Home in 1952 by my great-uncle, Thomas Vance, and subsequently placed with a foster family, confirmed the forced separation of mother and son and the family's intervention to bury Sarah's story and her child. David, the secret son raised in the cottage, had been renamed and rerouted into a new life, away from his biological mother and the community where he was born. The shadow my grandmother spoke of was the consequence of this action, the forced disappearance of Sarah and David from their original lives to protect the family's reputation. My search for David Vance, the man who was once David Miller, born in 1940, continued, now with the knowledge of his time in foster care, and the location where he was placed. The records from the foster care system were often private, but with the help of the genealogist and by demonstrating a legitimate family connection, we were able to access some non-identifying information about his placement. We learned that David had been placed with a kind and stable foster family in a rural area of the state. He had grown up with them, attended local schools, and eventually, it seemed, built a life for himself in that region. The records did not contain his current contact information, but they provided a general area where he had lived as a young adult. We focused our search on that region, looking for anyone named David Vance, born in May 1940, whose history might connect to the foster family he was placed with. It was a challenging search, as David Vance is a relatively common name, and privacy concerns surrounding foster care records made it difficult to access definitive information. While searching, we came across an obituary for a woman named Eleanor Vance, who had passed away in that region several years ago. Her age aligned with what David's foster mother would have been. The obituary mentioned surviving children, including a son named David Vance. Could this be David? Raised by a foster family and given his great-aunt's name as his own? Or perhaps it was a coincidence of names? Or even a deliberate act by my great-uncle to link him to the family name, while separating him from his mother. The layers of potential connection and hidden meaning felt complex. We continued to search for a current address or contact information for this David Vance, the son mentioned in the obituary. Eventually, we found a potential address in a small town in that region. Reaching out to him felt like the culmination of a long and emotionally challenging journey. I was potentially about to contact a man whose life had been profoundly shaped by my family's actions and secrets. A man who may or may not know the truth of his origins. I decided to write him a letter, just as I had done when contacting the potential descendants of the man from the Blackwood Mill story. I introduced myself, explained my connection to the Vance family, and mentioned the discovery of old family documents and records related to a David Vance, born in May 1940. Who was placed in foster care in that region in the 1950s. I gently explained that my research suggested he might be that David Vance, and that if so, there was a complex family history that connected us. A history related to a woman named Sarah Miller, his biological mother, and Eleanor Callahan Vance, the woman who raised him in a cottage in Port Blossom. I offered to share more, to answer any questions, and emphasized that my intention was to share the truth that had been hidden for a long time, to honor the lives involved, and to provide him with information about his origins if he was open to receiving it. I included my contact information. Sending the letter felt like sending a message across a lifetime of silence and buried secrets. The waiting period was filled with anxiety and anticipation. Would he receive it? Would he believe me? How would he react to the news that his life story was far more complex and hidden than he had ever imagined? Then, one rainy afternoon, my phone rang. An unknown number from an area code in that region. My heart pounded. I took a deep breath and answered. Hello? Is this Clara Davis? The voice was male, older, with a quiet uncertainty. Yes, I said, my voice trembling. This is Clara Davis. My name is David Vance, he said. I received your letter about Sarah Miller and Eleanor Callaghan Vance and about being placed in foster care. It was him, David Miller, now David Vance, the boy from the cottage, the man whose life was shaped by secrets he was only now discovering. Chapter 5.1. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to David Vance, the man whose life story had been hidden for over 70 years, the baby raised in secret in the cottage, the boy renamed and rerouted into a new life through foster care. Hearing his voice, connecting with the tangible reality of the man I had searched for, was a profound and emotional moment. We talked for a long time that first call, and in many calls that followed. David's voice was filled with a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and a deep sadness as he processed the information in my letter. He had known he was adopted, but the details had always been vague. His foster parents, the Eleanors who raised him, were kind and loving, but they had shared limited information about his early life or his biological family. The names Sarah Miller, Eleanor Callaghan Vance, these were names he had never heard before. The cottage in Port Blossom, a place he didn't remember, was revealed to be the location of his earliest years, a sanctuary where he was raised in secret. He shared his life story with me, growing up in a loving foster home. His life in the rural part of the state, his career, his family. He had a good life, he said, a life filled with love and stability. But there had always been unanswered questions about his origins, a sense of a missing piece of his identity. My letter had provided those answers in a way he could never have anticipated. The truth was painful, revealing a history of a mother forced to give him up, a father whose identity was hidden, a great aunt who sacrificed her life to raise him in secret, and a family who orchestrated a forced separation to bury a scandal. But it was also a truth that brought clarity, a sense of understanding the roots of his life, the reasons behind the unanswered questions he had carried for so long. We decided to meet in person. David traveled to Port Blossom, to the cottage that held the secrets of his earliest years. Seeing him step out of the car, an older man with a quiet demeanor, approaching the cottage that was both his first home and the site of his hidden past, was deeply moving. We spent time in the cottage, walking through the rooms, looking out at the sea. I shared more details from Great Aunt Eleanor's journals, showing him the entries about raising him, the love she had for him, the agonizing choice of whether to tell him the truth. He saw the photographs of Mary Davis, his biological mother, a young woman whose face was filled with both youth and sorrow. He saw the guardianship agreement, the formal documentation of the secret arrangement that shaped his life. We visited the cemetery, standing by Great Aunt Eleanor's grave, honoring the woman who raised him, the woman who had carried the burden of his secret for decades. We also visited the likely grave of Thomas Miller, his biological mother's husband, lost at sea in 1952, the event that triggered the family's intervention. David was quiet throughout the visit, absorbing the history, the emotions, the weight of the past. It was a lot to process. A lifetime of assumptions being challenged by a newly revealed truth. We talked about his biological mother, Mary Davis, about the difficulty of her choice, the pain she must have endured. David expressed a quiet sadness that he had never had the chance to know her, to hear her story from her own lips. But he also found a sense of peace in knowing about her, in understanding the circumstances that led her to make such a difficult decision. The identity of his biological father, James Callahan, a cousin from my own family tree, was a more complex revelation. a man who had seemingly walked away from his responsibility, leaving his son to be raised in secret. David felt a mix of curiosity about his father, but also a quiet anger at his apparent abandonment. He chose not to pursue a connection with James Callahan's living children, feeling that revealing the truth at this stage would cause unnecessary pain and disruption to their lives. Our relationship, forged in the shared journey of uncovering this hidden history, grew into a deep and meaningful connection. We were family, connected by blood and by the complex tapestry of secrets and choices that had shaped our lives. David was not just a relative. He was a piece of our family history brought into the light, a testament to the enduring power of human connection and the unpredictable ways lives are intertwined across generations. Chapter 5.2: The journey that began with the inheritance of a dilapidated cottage and a hidden hope chest had culminated in the discovery of a long-buried family secret, the story of a hidden child, a forced separation, and the complex, sometimes heartbreaking choices made by those who came before us. Finding David Vance, the man whose life was shaped by these secrets, and connecting with him as family, brought a profound sense of purpose and resolution to my own life. David, now in his 70s, was integrating the truth of his origins into the narrative of his life. He had a loving family, a successful career, a life filled with meaning. The knowledge of his hidden past didn't erase the life he had lived. It added layers of complexity, a deeper understanding of the circumstances that led him to the life he had. He honored the memory of great-aunt Eleanor, the woman who raised him with love and courage, acknowledging the immense sacrifice she had made. He found a sense of peace in understanding his biological mother, Mary Davis, the difficult hand she was dealt, and her enduring love for him as revealed in her letters. The cottage, once a symbol of secrecy and isolation, was slowly being restored, becoming a tangible link to the past, a place where David's story began, a place that held the echoes of a hidden life. The restoration became a shared project, a way for David and me to connect with our family history, to honor the people who came before us, and to create a space that reflected the truth of its past, a past that was no longer hidden in the shadows. The secrets, carried by my grandmother and other family members for so many years, had been heavy burdens. The decision to bury Sarah's story, to separate mother and child, was a product of a different era, different societal pressures, and a family's desire to protect its reputation. While understanding the context, the pain caused by that decision, the disruption to lives, was undeniable. But in bringing the truth into the light, in connecting with David, we were, in a way, offering a form of amends, acknowledging the past, and ensuring that the lives and sacrifices of those involved were no longer hidden. My own life had been unexpectedly enriched by this journey. I had uncovered a fascinating and complex part of my family history, connected with a relative I never knew existed, and gained a deeper understanding of the intricate ways lives are intertwined across generations. The mystery of the Cedar chest had led me not just to a hidden story, but to a profound human connection, a reminder that the most valuable legacies are often not material wealth, but the truths we uncover and the relationships we build. The whispers in the walls of the cottage had finally been heard, revealing a story of love, loss, sacrifice, and the enduring power of truth to connect and to heal. David Vance, the hidden child of the cottage, was no longer a secret. He was family, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the extraordinary ways lives can unfold, guided by threads of destiny, secrets revealed, and the quiet courage to face the past and embrace the unexpected connections of the present. The cedar chest, once a repository of buried secrets, had become a symbol of hope and connection. A reminder that even after 80 years, it is never too late to uncover the truth and find your way home to the story of who you are.